Morning, everybody. Morning. We're back in John in our Captivated series. This morning I've loosely titled it, The Crowd, the Critic and the Muse. And so we're going to be looking at John 6 verses 14 to 24. And I think it'd be good to just jump into the whole passage together. So it says, 14, after the people saw the sign that Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The next day, the crowd that stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but they had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. So this morning, this isn't a 3-point sermon like Joe did last week, but I am going to break it into 3 chunks. So I loved what Joe shared last week, particularly around the invitation to participate in the miracles with Jesus. I am yet to feed 5,000 people or walk on water, although Malcolm, when he gave me this passage, did say he wanted a practical demonstration. So if you'd like to all follow me to Nine Springs, let's all go and that'd be fun, wouldn't it? So this passage follows immediately after the feeding of the 5,000, as Joe shared last week. And so that's where it says here, after the people saw the sign that Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who came into the world. So knowing where we are from is important. The Israelite people knew where they were from. They knew their stories from their ancestors. They knew where they came from. They knew the promises that had been spoken before them, many generations before. And Adam's shared on this. Different ones of us have shared this at different times. But all of the children in the Israelite community would have gone to study and learn the Torah. So every child would have known the law. Every child would have known their history. Every child would have known where they'd come from. And then few would have gone on to learn the whole of the Old Testament, and then still others would have gone on to become rabbis and they would teach others. But most of them would end up working in the family trade, but all of them knew where they had come from. All of them knew the stories of their past. All of them knew the prophecies and the promises of what God would do one day. So Jesus performing this miracle of feeding the 5,000 with bread, to us it's like, wow, that's amazing. To those people it's actually like, oh, that echoes Moses. And that echoes the performing of the amazing miracle in the desert of providing bread in the desert to feed the people. And Moses himself speaks a prophecy that God would raise up a new prophet, a new king, someone that would be his mouthpiece. And in Deuteronomy 18, 15 to 18, it says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him, for this is what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see the great fire anymore, or we will die. So the Lord said to me, what they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you among their fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell everything I command of him. There are 351 prophecies throughout the Old Testament that are fulfilled in Jesus' life. And not all of these would have happened at that point, but it was becoming increasingly clear to the people that Jesus was the Messiah that had been spoken about. This verse here, so after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into this world. At this time, they were living under Roman oppression, and they had come for a king to come into power. They were waiting for someone who would fulfill the promises and would overthrow the Roman Empire. He would become the new king that they would follow. And if this king also happened to be able to miraculously feed them, that was a pretty good thing as well. So Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. I know we all want to talk about the walking on water, but this really stood out to me this week. It was common in those times that if a crowd found somebody popular who they liked, they would make that person king by force. And the king here was a political role. It was a ruler who would do well for the people. It was a position of power and authority and rule. And this is what they were longing and hoping for. But this is not who Jesus was. And this is not the kingdom that he'd come to establish on earth. Yes, he came to be king, but he didn't come to take it by force. And it's so easy at times to lose our identity when the crowd is involved. We see this with celebrities all the time, especially those who become famous really, really young. And they're given money and fame and become untouchable. And in the end, they're so consumed in trying to please the crowd and trying to keep that fame that actually they start to lose what made them famous and appealing in the first place. Did anybody here watch the Lewis Capaldi documentary that came out last year? No? This guy? It's on Netflix, and it was this fascinating, that's a pretty good picture. It was a fascinating and kind of heartbreaking documentary following the amazing rise to success of Lewis Capaldi. Even if you don't recognize his name, you will have heard one of his songs because they're played everywhere. He's an amazing songwriter, quite something as a performer, and he had huge success with a number of songs that exploded. And then he was going through the huge pressure of trying to write another round of amazing songs that the fans would want to hear and beat the second album syndrome. He was trying to write that better second album than the first. And it was a really difficult watch because the pressure he had taken upon him to keep up his persona, the pressure to keep fulfilling the crowd's needs and wants for him, to keep up the amazing music that they all loved. And his success was actually starting to really impact his mental health and making him more and more and more unwell. As soon as we give into the crowd and do what everybody else thinks we should do, we compromise. We lose our original thoughts and we become a lesser version of ourselves. I love here that Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew to the mountain by himself. He didn't follow the desires of the crowd. He went to the mountain. And throughout the Old Testament, God meets with his people on the mountain. So when he's going to the mountain, Jesus is going to meet with his Father and to be reminded of who he was by God and God alone, not by the crowd. And this verse really stood out to me this week because I'm sure, like many of you here, I've had some very specific prophetic words spoken over me in the past, words that I never forget. However, there are times when you get so consumed in what you're doing, or life gets busy, or situations arise, and you get caught up in what everybody else wants you to do, that I actually forget those words and forget the things that God has spoken over me. So I had my own mountain moment, but on a beach on Monday, where actually I really needed a bit of a pep talk from God, and I needed reminding of those specific words because I'd taken my eyes off of the things that he was saying, and I needed to fix back onto him and not the things that others were saying around me. How often do we lose ourselves in the noise of the crowd? How easy is it to change our habits, change our dreams, even our identity because of what others think, say, and do? Karen, if you're watching, this is the time to take Joshie out of the room. Since going to school, I've noticed that Joshie has started picking up on things from other people. Started learning things from other people. Really important things like Ronaldo celebrations, running to the room and going, "Soo!" and football dances all around, those kind of really important things. But a little while ago, he was trying to do something and he messed up. And I heard him saying, "I'm useless, I'm the worst in the world." And this is something that we would never, ever say to him. And hearing him, I hated it. It really upset me. It upsets me now. Because he's picked up these things from the crowd around him. He's picked up these words that are negative. And he is an amazing boy. And God has amazing future plans for him. So as his father, I swept him up held him in my arms, grabbed him, reminded him of, you are my son, I love you, you are amazing. And actually I made him then tell me 7 great things about him instead, because I wasn't standing for that. But I had to remind him how loved he is, whose son he is, and remind him of the person that he is made to be. The crowd is noisy. Culture is noisy. And if Jesus, the Son of God, needed to go and be reminded who he was in the presence of his Father, how much more important is that for each one of us? Have you lost something of your identity because of your colleagues? Have you lost something because you follow the crowd and become something you're not? Or have you ended up even in positions because other people have said, that'd be really good for you to do. And you go, okay, yeah, that would be good for me to do. That actually you've ended up doing things that are not yours to hold and actually don't even represent who you are. We'll take some time to pray into that later, because it is essential that we go up the mountain away from the crowd and are reminded by our Heavenly Father who we are and who he has created us to be. So the second chunk, Jesus walking on water. Here's a little gag that I enjoyed.
I've been teaching the disciples all week. It's nice to actually take a break and have a little fun. Cannonball!
I enjoyed that. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. This is the most classic of Sunday school stories. The amazing image of the disciples in a boat in the storm and Jesus approaching them on the water. And this happens in the Sea of Galilee, which is in the lower portion of the Jordan Valley. And there's mountains all around that reach up to like 4,000 feet. So one of the key things about this bit of water is that it was susceptible to sudden storms. Cold air would rush down off the mountains, hit the warm air along the water, and then basically these huge storms would suddenly appear. So here we have Jesus' disciples, a bunch of whom are fishermen. You know, they're watermen, they're spending their lives out on the sea. This is what they know. They're 3 or 4 miles offshore with the wind blowing and the waters growing rough. But this would be normal for them. It's normal for them to cross the water. It's normal for them to go out at night and try and fish. It's normal for them to experience storms, because this is normal for that area. It's not a secret that I love adventure, snow or water or bikes, and occasionally I like to just push myself and go off on my own and have a little adventure, whether that's trail running at night with a head torch, or I got up and just decided I'd try and cycle to Bristol in the rain and ended up having to be rescued near Chew Magna Lake because I got lost and cold. Last year I went ski touring, and we ski toured up to the top of a mountain, which was amazing. I've been paddleboarding by moonlight along a river. I like to turn normal things into an adventure. And a little while ago I was down at Lee Abbey and been there to lead worship at the swim conference. I took my paddleboard with me and I decided I was going to try and get round the headland. I strapped my bag to the front, so it was quite front heavy, pushed myself out. I ended up pushing out into quite big swell. I got out the end of the bay and I found myself in huge rolling waves. And I had one of those moments where I was like, what have I done? And I didn't see Jesus walking on the water that day. And I was only ever probably 50 meters from shore, but I did find myself praying desperately, Lord, please don't let me die, please don't let me die. And I did fight the current, and I'm standing here today, got back to shore. I didn't tell Claire, and I've never told my mum. Sorry, Deb. But there's the disciples in the boat who know that, they know that area. You know, they're not just me trying to have a go at an adventure around the headland. These guys know the waters. They know what they're doing. Regardless how experienced you are, though, being in a small boat in the middle of the sea on a storm is a dangerous place and not a great place to be. And there's a few beautiful things about this story because, as I said earlier, he's just come off the back of feeding the 5,000. The disciples have witnessed the miracle power of Jesus, that he can feed and he can produce food. They're becoming increasingly sure that this is the Messiah they've been waiting for, and they're committed to following him. They're following him everywhere. In their history and stories from where they come from, they know that God has the power and the authority to control the seas and waters. Moses, thank you AI, commanded the sea to split into two so the Israelites could cross through into Pharaoh. So they know that God has the power over the waters. And there's that story when it's time to cross the Jordan and they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and as soon as they step their feet to the river, the water stops. God has the authority over the waters. AI wasn't quite so good with this one. This is the Ark of the Covenant in Petra in Jordan. Just didn't really work drawing the Ark of the Covenant crossing the Jordan, but there you go. They know that God has the authority over the waters. So here they have Jesus once again showing who he is, because he's commanding the elements, he's controlling the waters, and here walking out to them. And yet here they are on a boat in a storm, and they see Jesus performing another miracle, and they are afraid. They saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." And in the Matthew version of this story, it even says that they thought he was a ghost. They were afraid, and Jesus says, "It is I, do not be afraid." In the same way, Jesus meets his followers in the storms and comforts them. Jesus always meets us in the storm. Jesus always meets us in the storm. Whether we recognize him is a different question. And his disciples, who were following him everywhere, they knew everything about him. They saw what he was capable of, and yet they didn't recognize him walking on the waters. And I don't know for you whether you're in a storm at the moment and whether you can recognize that Jesus is walking towards you. Or even you've been in storms and you can look back and go, "Oh yeah, I saw Jesus was there. Jesus was with me in the midst of that." Because Jesus always meets us in the storm. It might be scary. It might not be what we were expecting. We might not even recognize him as he's walking towards us. We just need to have our eyes open to see Jesus approaching. This verse here, then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. That translation is a little funny there. It's like they were willing. Others say glad or eager. And once they recognized that that was Jesus and that he was there in the storm with him, they were eager and desperate. Get into the boat here with me. And in our lives, Jesus always meets us in the storm. But how eager and desperate are we to grab him and go, "Come and be here with the storm. Be in the boat with me." And I don't know whether today you're in a stormy season and actually the invitation is to open your eyes and allow Jesus to get in the boat with you. It then says, immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. And I don't think that means that they got in the boat and all of a sudden there was an outboard motor and they suddenly just got there to the end. I don't think this is a teleportation story. I think this is more about Jesus doesn't want us to dwell in the past. Jesus doesn't want us to stay held in our brokenness in the storm. Actually, he wants to take us forward. He wants to take us to where we're heading. He meets us in the storm and immediately takes us forward to where we're heading. He doesn't protect us from ever facing storms. The storms are still there. He doesn't stop us from facing challenges, but he meets us in the midst of the storm and he takes us forward. I'm not going to go into it much because we're in John, but in the Matthew version, this is probably the more common known story that we would read. It talks about Peter jumping out of the water to him. And just here in these verses, it says from verse 27, but Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." And Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out the boat, walked on the water and came toward Jesus. When he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, crying out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" I love that as soon as Peter knows that Jesus is present on the water, he wants to go and be with him there. I long to be a person that as soon as I hear Jesus' voice in the storm, I come running. I jump into the water. I long to be a person who's so in pursuit of Jesus that the elements don't stop me trying to get close to him. I long to be a person that even as Peter gets afraid there and starts to sink, his first instinct is, Lord, save me. I long to be a person who cries that out immediately. Not just, Lord, please don't let me die, please don't let me die. I long to have a faith that is so aware of who Jesus is and what he's capable of that I would chase after him every day. And that final chunk of the passage today says, the next day the crowd who had stayed on the opposite side of the shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but they'd gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the people realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. The crowd were waiting desperately for Jesus' arrival. They were hungry to hear his words, see his miracles, and be in the presence of the Messiah. This is amazing. They're waiting desperately. They are waiting desperately to see his arrival. They're hungry for more food, but hungry for more of his word. They're hungry to see more of his miracles. They're desperate to be in his presence. And when they realized Jesus was no longer where they were, they jump in their boats and go in search of him. This is just so simple. They pursued Jesus physically to be close to him. It's as simple as that. They wanted more of what he had to offer, so they chased him to be with him. And I've had a few conversations with people this week that have all been around a similar theme of pursuing Jesus, but also what we do when we gather here on a Sunday. Is this morning the only time you've met with Jesus this week? Brilliant, Russell. Claire and I sometimes have crazy weeks where she's out multiple nights in the week. She's doing youth groups and I might have an event on at the weekend, and we can go for days and days without really seeing each other. And this means that then when we do see each other, we end up trying to catch up on the kids, on family admin, on the house jobs, of what we've both been up to, on telling each other we love each other, on like the whole of life all in one quick gathering. And if you only ever meet Jesus once a week here on a Sunday morning, in the midst of a busy life, we turn up and we come with our to-do list. Right, Jesus, I'm here. You better sort this out today. I need this healing. I've got this prayer shopping list. I've got all of last week's baggage that we haven't had a chance to process, so we can deal with that today. I love you, by the way. And I'm listening. Can you tell me you love me too? If we try and do all of that in our once a week gathering on a Sunday morning, we totally miss the beauty of what a relationship is supposed to look like. Claire and I can't have weeks like that forever. And thankfully that's a rare thing. That's not every single week. Because relationships don't work if you don't have time for each other. Relationships don't work if you don't spend moments doing normal things and sharing your feelings and sharing what's going on in your lives together. If Sunday mornings are our only connection point to God, we miss the point of a relationship with Jesus. We need to be people who, like the crowd, jump in the boat to go and pursue where he is, to go and be near him. Like Peter, who as soon as we hear his voice, we leap out to try and walk onto the water. Imagine if on a Sunday morning, when we gathered here, every single one of us is coming in off the back of having been in quiet time with God every morning, in having shared our faith in our workplace, in having been praying for our neighbours and seeing breakthrough. And when we get here together, we all go, woo! God's been doing all this all week. Let's be a group and celebrate all the good things God done. Or imagine we walk through the door and say, this is who God is in me. Let me be a blessing to those around. Imagine what this place would be like on a Sunday morning. And imagine what our relationships with God would look like if that's the case. In the same way that Jesus goes up the mountain to meet with God and to be reminded of who he is, we need to be people who create rhythms and patterns where we go up the mountain and spend time with him regularly. So we have the band up. I think there's 3 questions in these 3 chunks. Just as Jesus had to go up the mountain to not be led by the crowd, but to be reminded who he was by the Father. Are there areas in your life where you need to be reminded of who you are by the Father? Have you gone off course? Has the crowd made you do something or spoken things over you that are not who God has made you to be? Do you need to recognize that Jesus is with you in the storm? Are you in a storm season? And actually Jesus always meets us in the storm. But maybe you haven't got your eyes open to see it. Or you're not willing to see that he's here and wants to get in the boat with you. And if this is the only time you meet with Jesus in your week, are there new rhythms you need to build to follow Jesus closer? Should we stand? We'll just leave these questions up on the screen a minute. I'm not going to fill this with lots of words because these are for us to process together. But if any of these things you're going, I need prayer for this morning, then we have a prayer ministry team who are going to be around at the back of the room. And I would strongly encourage you to go and be prayed for this morning. Jesus, may we be people who pursue you with hungry, desperate hearts. Would we be people who are reminded of who we were made to be by you and you alone, not by the crowd and the noises around us. And Jesus, may we recognize that you always meet us in the storm. May we have our eyes open, our hearts open, and be willing to invite you into the boat with us.